We all dread our first day at a new job. But what if that job was in a place that felt alive with its own dark secrets? Join me as I recount the truly unnerving events of my terrifying night shift at a rural hospital, where the silence was heavy and every shadow seemed to hold a sinister secret. You'll never look at hospitals the same way again. The GPS signal died 3 miles before I reached Mercy General Hospital, leaving me to navigate the winding backroads of East Texas by moonlight alone. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their gnarled branches creating skeletal shadows that danced across my windshield. When the hospital finally emerged from the darkness, my first thought was that I'd made a terrible mistake. Mercy General looked nothing like the modern medical facilities I'd worked at in Dallas. The building seemed to sag under the weight of decades, its red brick facade crumbling in places where ivy had taken hold. Only half the windows showed any light, creating a checkerboard pattern of illumination and darkness that made the structure appear diseased. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a handful of cars clustered near the staff entranced like frightened animals seeking shelter. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring up at the imposing structure. The job posting had been too good to pass up, triple the pay I was making in the city, full benefits, and they were so desperate they'd hire me over the phone. Now, looking at this place, I understood why they were having trouble filling positions. The automatic doors wheezed open as I approached, their sensors apparently struggling with age. The lobby was dimly lit, furnished with outdated chairs that looked like they belonged in a 1980s waiting room. A single security guard sat behind the information desk, his head tilted back in what might have been sleep or death. It was impossible to tell from a distance. "You must be the new night nurse," came a voice from behind me. I spun around to find a woman in scrubs so faded they might have once been blue. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Her name tag read Janet RN. "I'm Rebecca," I said, extending my hand. Janet looked at my outstretched hand for a long moment before shaking it with fingers that felt ice cold despite the humid Texas night. "Follow me. We need to get you oriented before things get busy." The way she emphasized that last word sent a chill down my spine, but I followed her through a maze of corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. The hospital felt much larger on the inside than it had appeared from the parking lot, as if the building had been folding in on itself for years, creating impossible spaces and forgotten rooms. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the hallways, the sound seeming to bounce off walls that weren't quite where they should be. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows that made me jump more than once. Janet walked with the confident stride of someone who'd navigated these halls for years, never once looking back to see if I was keeping up. "How long have you worked here?" I asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. "Time moves differently at night," she replied without turning around. "You'll understand soon enough." We passed several patient rooms, most with their doors closed and nameplates that were either blank or bore names I couldn't quite make out in the dim lighting. From behind one door, I heard what sounded like crying, or maybe laughter. It was impossible to tell which, and something about that uncertainty made my stomach clench. The nurses' station sat at the center of what Janet called the main wing, though I suspected there were other wings I hadn't seen yet. 2 other nurses were present. A tall, thin man named David whose pale skin seemed almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and an older woman called Nurse Patricia who spoke only in whispers and kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to sneak up behind her. "Where is everyone?" I asked, looking around the eerily quiet station. In Dallas, the night shift was always bustling with activity. Patients needing medication, families asking questions, doctors making rounds. Here, the silence was so complete, I could hear the ancient ventilation system struggling to circulate air through the building. "Night shift is different here," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Quieter. We have special protocols. Janet shot him a sharp look. We'll get to that. First, let me show you your station. She led me to a small desk positioned in the corner of the nurse's station, equipped with an outdated computer that looked like it belonged in a museum and a phone that might have been original to the building. A thick, leather-bound notebook sat beside the keyboard, its pages yellowed with age. "This is yours," Janet said, placing her hand on the notebook. "Everything you need to know about working nights at Mercy General is in here. Read it carefully. Follow every instruction exactly as written. Never deviate from the protocols, no matter what you might think you know about nursing." I opened a notebook, expecting to find standard hospital procedures and medication lists. Instead, I found page after page of handwritten rules in various inks and handwriting styles, as if different people had added to it over the years. The first page was headed simply, "Night Shift Rules. Follow or leave." Rule number 1. Never enter room 237 between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. Rule number 2. If you hear children laughing in the basement, do not investigate. Rule number 3. The patient in room 101 does not exist. Do not acknowledge them if they call for help. My hands began to tremble as I read further down the page. These were medical protocols. They were warnings. Each rule seemed more bizarre and disturbing than the last. Written in urgent, sometimes shaky handwriting that suggested fear rather than standard procedure. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, looking up at Janet. Her expression was deadly serious. "Does this look like a place that jokes about anything?" Before I could respond, the lights in the nurse's station flickered 3 times in quick succession. All 3 nurses immediately stopped what they were doing and turned toward the main hallway, their faces tense with anticipation. "What was that?" I whispered. "The signal," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. "It's starting." "What's starting?" Janet closed the notebook and placed it firmly in my hands. "Your education. Read every rule in that book tonight, Rebecca. Memorize them. Your life might depend on it." She paused, glancing toward the darkened hallway, where something seemed to be moving just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. "And whatever you do, remember that some patients are not what they appear to be." The building groaned around us, a sound like old bones settling, and I realized that my first night at Mercy General Hospital was going to be unlike anything I'd experienced before. The notebook felt heavy in my hands, weighted with secrets and warnings that I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, I knew I had no choice but to learn. The notebook felt heavier with each page I turned, its leather binding worn smooth by countless nervous hands. By the time I'd read through the first dozen rules, my coffee had grown cold, and a persistent chill had settled in my bones despite the oppressive humidity that seemed to permeate every corner of Mercy General. Rule number 14. If a patient asks you to turn off the lights in their room after 2 a.m., agree, but never actually do it. Simply nod and leave immediately. Rule number 15. The elevators should not be used alone after 11 p.m. If you must use them, count aloud to 10 before pressing any button. Rule number 16. If you see a nurse you don't recognize wearing a uniform from the 1950s, do not speak to her. She died in the fire of 1962 and doesn't know she's gone. I looked up from a notebook to find Janet watching me intently from across the nurse's station. "Questions?" she asked. "All of this," I gestured to the book, "is completely insane. Nurses don't follow superstitions. We follow medical protocols and evidence-based practice." David let out a bitter laugh from his position at the medication cart. "I said the same thing on my first night. That was 3 years ago. Now I know better. These rules aren't suggestions," Patricia whispered, nervously adjusting her glasses. "They're survival instructions. This hospital, it's not like other places. It's old, Rebecca. Really old. And some things that should have died here a long time ago just didn't." Before I could ask what she meant, the phone at my station rang with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The ancient bell seemed to echo through the halls far longer than it should have. Janet gestured for me to answer it. "Mercy General, Rebecca speaking." Silence greeted me, followed by what sounded like breathing. Not the normal rhythm of human respiration, but something slower, more deliberate. After nearly a minute, a voice spoke, thin, reedy, and unmistakably male. "Room 237 is cold. So very cold." The line went dead. I looked at the caller ID, but it showed only static symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "Room 237, I said to Janet. Someone called about it being cold. All three nurses exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual fear. Patricia actually took a step backward, nearly knocking over a chair. "What room number did you say?" Janet asked carefully. "Room 237. The caller said it was cold." "There is no room 237, David said flatly. "This wing only goes up to 235. I frowned, pulling out the hospital floor plan that had been in my orientation packet. He was right. The main wing had rooms numbered 201 through 235. No room 237 existed on any floor. Then who called? Janet's face had gone pale. "Check the rules about room 237 again. Rule number 1. I flipped back to the first page. Never enter room 237 between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. I looked at the clock on the wall, 11:47 p.m. But if there's no room 237, then why is there a rule about it? Because, Patricia whispered, sometimes rooms exist when they shouldn't. And sometimes patients call from places that aren't supposed to be there. A cold draft swept through the nurse's station, carrying with it the faint scent of antiseptic and something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The fluorescent lights above us began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. "I need to check on the patients," I said, standing up. The normalcy of routine nursing tasks felt like a lifeline in this ocean of impossibility. "Take the notebook with you," Janet insisted. "And remember, follow the rules exactly. No matter what you see or hear, follow the rules." I tucked the notebook under my arm and headed down the main corridor, my sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had seen better decades. The patient rooms stretched out on either side, most with their doors slightly ajar and their occupants presumably sleeping. But as I walked, I became aware of sounds that shouldn't have been there. Whispers coming from empty rooms, the soft rustle of bedsheets being moved by unseen hands. Room 201 contained an elderly man who appeared to be sleeping peacefully. His chart indicated he was recovering from hip surgery, a routine case. But as I approached his bed to check his vitals, his eyes snapped open, fixing on me with an intensity that made me step backward. "You're new," he said in a voice like grinding gravel. "They always bring fresh ones eventually. I'm Rebecca, your night nurse. How are you feeling, Mr. Thompson?" He studied me for a long moment, his pupils dilated despite the bright room lights. "The rules," he whispered. "Have they given you the rules yet?" I held up the notebook. "Yes, I'm reading through them." Good. He nodded enthusiastically, his head moving in a way that seemed to involve too many vertebrae. "Rule number 23 is very important. About the ice machine." I quickly flipped through the notebook until I found rule number 23. If the ice machine on the second floor dispensing ice that appears black or moves on its own, do not use it and immediately inform the night supervisor. "Why is that important, Mr. Thompson?" But when I looked up, his eyes were closed, and he appeared to be sleeping again. His breathing was regular, his face peaceful. If not for the conversation we just had, I would have assumed he'd been unconscious the entire time. I continued my rounds, checking on each patient, and tried to ignore the growing list of impossibilities I was encountering. Room 209 contained a woman who claimed to be a former nurse at the hospital. though her stories about working here didn't match any of the timelines I'd learned during orientation. She spoke of colleagues with names that weren't on any current staff roster and described procedures that hadn't been used in decades. In room 215, I found something that made my blood freeze. The patient, according to his chart, a middle-aged man named Robert Martinez, was lying in his bed, apparently asleep. But his reflection in the window beside his bed showed a completely different person. A young woman with long, dark hair and eyes that seemed to be looking directly at me. I blinked hard and looked again. The reflection had returned to normal, showing only Robert's sleeping form. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental about reality had just shifted in that room. By the time I reached room 232, my hands were shaking, and I begun to question my own sanity. The notebook's rules were starting to make a horrible kind of sense. This wasn't a hospital in any conventional meaning of the word. It was something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between what was possible and what was real. Room 232's door was slightly ajar, and I could hear movement inside. According to the chart, it should have been empty. The previous patient had been discharged that afternoon, but as I pushed the door open, I saw the outline of a figure sitting in the chair beside the window. "Hello," I called softly. The figure turned, and in the dim light filtering through the blinds, I saw the face of a woman who might have been beautiful once. Her skin was waxy pale, and her eyes reflected the hallway light like an animal's. She wore a hospital gown that seemed to be from a different era, with patterns and styling I didn't recognize. "Are you the new nurse?" she asked, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. I checked the room number again. Definitely 232. Definitely supposed to be empty. Yes, I'm Rebecca. But according to my records, this room isn't occupied." She smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Records don't always tell the whole story, dear. Sometimes patients check themselves in through alternative methods. I'll need to see your admission forms." "Oh, I've been here much longer than any forms would indicate. Since before they used forms at all, really." She stood up, and I realized she was much taller than she'd appeared while sitting. "You should read your rules more carefully, Rebecca, especially the ones about patients who aren't in the computer system." I fumbled through the notebook until I found rule number 18. Some patients exist outside of official records. They are to be treated with extreme caution and never directly questioned about their admission status. When I looked up, the room was empty. The chair where she'd been sitting still rocked gently back and forth. The clock in the nurse's station had just struck midnight when the screaming began. It started low, almost like a whisper carried on the air conditioning system, but quickly escalated into something that raised every hair on my arms. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the very air itself vibrating with anguish. "Room 101, Patricia said, not looking up from her paperwork. Her pen continued scratching across the page, as if the horrific sound were nothing more than background noise. I flipped frantically through the notebook until I found the rule that had haunted me since my first reading. Rule number 3. The patient in room 101 does not exist. Do not acknowledge them if they call for help. Someone's in distress, I said, standing up. We have to help them. Janet's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Sit down, Rebecca. Follow the rules. The screaming intensified, now accompanied by what sounded like furniture being thrown against walls. Other patients were beginning to stir. I could hear confused voices from various rooms, the ding of call buttons being pressed repeatedly. This is insane, I protested. I took an oath to help people, and you'll help more people by staying exactly where you are, David said, his face pale but determined. Trust me on this. The sound from room 101 suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Thick and oppressive, like the air before a storm. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Then came the knocking. 3 soft taps, barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system. Then 3 more. The sound was coming from the direction of room 101, but it wasn't the kind of knocking you'd expect from someone trapped in a room. This was deliberate, rhythmic, almost polite. "Please," came a voice from the same direction. Male, middle-aged, speaking with the careful diction of someone trying very hard to sound reasonable. "I know you can hear me out there. I just need some water. My throat is so dry." I looked at my colleagues. Janet was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Patricia was muttering what might have been a prayer under her breath. David was staring at his computer screen as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Please," the voice came again, closer now. "I've been calling for hours. The other nurses, they must not have heard me. But you're new, aren't you? You still care about helping people." Against every instinct screaming at me to stay seated, I found myself reaching for a cup of water from the dispenser beside the nurse's station. "Don't," Janet whispered urgently. "Whatever you do, don't acknowledge him." "Him?" I asked. "So there's someone in room 101. "There's no room 101. All 3 of them said in unison, their voices flat and mechanical. But I could see the room from where I sat. The door was clearly marked 101, and a thin strip of light showed beneath it. As I watched, a shadow passed across that strip of light, as if someone was pacing back and forth inside. The knocking came again, more insistent now. "I can see your feet." "Nurse, I can see you standing there. Won't you please bring me some water? Just a small cup." Without conscious thought, I took a step toward room 101. The notebook fell from my lap, hitting the floor with a sound like thunder in the oppressive quiet. "Rebecca, no." Patricia's whisper was urgent, terrified, but something was pulling me forward. Not physically, but mentally. The voice from room 101 was so reasonable, so human in its simple need. What kind of nurse would ignore a patient's basic request for water? "I'm dying of thirst," the voice continued, and now I could hear what sounded like tears in it. "Please, I just need help. Why won't anyone help me?" I was halfway to the room when the smell hit me. It was the odor of decay, of something organic that had been left to rot in a warm, humid place. The smell grew stronger with each step I took, until it was so overwhelming I had to cover my nose and mouth with my sleeve. The door to room 101 stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. But as I approached, I could hear breathing from inside. Not the normal rhythm of human respiration, but something labored and wet, like lungs filled with fluid. "Just leave the water by the door," the voice said, and now it was coming from directly on the other side of the wooden barrier. "You don't have to come in. Just leave it there, and I'll get it in a moment." I reached for the door handle, my hand moving as if controlled by someone else. The metal was ice cold despite the warm night, and the moment my fingers made contact, every light in the hallway flickered once in unison. "Rebecca." Janet's voice cut through whatever spell had been drawing me forward. I jerked my hand back from the door handle and stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to get away from room 101. The voice from inside the room changed instantly. What had been pleading and reasonable became angry and human. It snarled with rage, the sound echoing strangely as if coming from a throat that wasn't quite the right shape for human speech. "You cannot ignore me forever," it said, the words dripping with malice. "I know where you live now, Rebecca. I know your scent." I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Janet immediately handed me the notebook, pointing to a rule I hadn't noticed before. Rule number 47. If you acknowledge the patient in room 101, leave the building immediately and do not return for at least 24 hours. Did I started to ask, but Janet shook her head. "You didn't speak to him. You didn't give him anything. You're safe." "What is that thing?" "We don't ask questions like that," David said firmly. "We follow the rules, we finish our shifts, and we go home." That's how we survive working here. For the next hour, I try to focus on routine tasks, updating patient charts, preparing medications, checking vital signs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with Mercy General Hospital, something that went far beyond unusual rules and strange patients. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I discovered rule number 52. If you find yourself in a hallway you don't recognize, turn around immediately and retrace your steps. Do not explore unfamiliar areas of the hospital. I was returning from checking on the patients in the East Wing when I realized I was lost. The hallway I was walking down looked similar to the others, but the room numbers were wrong. Instead of the 200s, these doors bore numbers in the 300s, 301, 302, 303. But according to the hospital floor plans, there was no third floor. The fluorescent lights here were dimmer than in the main wing, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the walls appear to pulse with their own rhythm. The air was thicker here, harder to breathe, and carried scents that had no business being in a medical facility. Wet earth, rotting wood, and something metallic that might have been blood. I turned around to retrace my steps, but the hallway behind me was gone. Where there should have been the corridor I just walked down, there was now a solid wall, painted the same institutional green as the rest of the hospital. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped in a section of the building that shouldn't exist, surrounded by patient rooms that couldn't possibly be there. And from behind the closed doors came sounds that no human patient should have been making, scratching, like claws on wood, and low, guttural moaning that spoke of pain beyond human comprehension. Room 313's door was ajar, and as I passed it, something inside spoke my name. Rebecca. The voice was Janet's, but distorted, as if coming through water or static. Rebecca, we need your help in here. I stopped, every instinct screaming at me to keep walking. But it sounded like Janet, and if my colleague was in trouble. Rebecca. The voice came again, more urgently now. Please, we're hurt. We need a nurse. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. The room was wrong. Instead of a standard patient room, it stretched back much farther than should have been possible, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. The walls were covered with what looked like years of water damage, dark stains that formed patterns almost like faces when viewed from the corner of my eye. In the center of the room stood three figures that might have been Janet, Patricia, and David. They were wearing the right clothes, had the right general appearance, but something was fundamentally off about each of them. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid, their smiles too wide for their faces. Come help us, Rebecca, the Janet thing said, and when it spoke, I could see that its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. We're learning so much about patient care, such interesting new techniques. I slammed the door shut and ran down the impossible hallway, no longer caring about following rules or maintaining professional composure. Behind me, I could hear laughter, the sound of my colleagues' voices twisted into something cruel and hungry. At the end of the hallway, I found a stairwell that definitely hadn't been in the original building plans. I took the stairs 3 at a time, not caring where they led as long as they got me away from whatever was pretending to be the people I worked with. When I finally burst through a door marked exit, I found myself back in the main wing, gasping and shaking. Janet, Patricia, and David were all exactly where I'd left them at the nurse's station, looking at me with expressions of concern. Rebecca, Janet asked, you look like you've seen a ghost. I stared at them, trying to determine if these were the real versions of my colleagues or more of the things I'd encountered in the impossible hallway. But they seemed normal, solid, genuinely worried about my welfare. I got lost, I managed to say. Found myself on a 3rd floor that shouldn't exist. All 3 of them exchanged looks that spoke of shared experience and mutual understanding. Rule number 52, Patricia said gently, you found your way back. That's good. Some people don't. At 2:47 a.m., I discovered the truth about Mercy General Hospital, and I wished immediately that I hadn't. It started with Mrs. Henderson in room 224. She'd been pressing her call button repeatedly, and since my colleagues seemed to be deliberately ignoring it, I decided to check on her myself. What I found was an elderly woman sitting upright in her bed, staring at the far wall with an expression of absolute terror. "Mrs. Henderson, you called for assistance." She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide and unfocused. "They're in the walls," she whispered. "Can't you hear them? They're in the walls, and they're hungry." I listened carefully, but heard only the usual hospital sounds: ventilation systems, distant equipment beeping, the occasional murmur from other rooms. "I don't hear anything unusual, Mrs. Henderson. Would you like me to get you something to help you sleep?" "No." She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Don't you understand? This place isn't what it appears to be. It never was. They built it on top of something that should have stayed buried." Before I could respond, she reached under her pillow and pulled out a yellowed photograph. The image showed Mercy General Hospital, but not as it appeared now. In the photo, the building was newer, cleaner, surrounded by what looked like construction equipment and workers. "My grandfather helped build this place in 1962, she said, pressing the photo into my hands. "He told me stories before he died, stories about what they found when they were digging the foundation." The photograph felt ice cold in my hands, and as I stared at it, the image seemed to shift and change. For just a moment, I could swear I saw something beneath the hospital in the photo. Dark spaces that extended far deeper into the earth than any building's foundation should go. "What do they find?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Caves," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Miles and miles of caves, filled with things that had been sleeping for a very long time. The construction workers who went down to explore them, most of them never came back up. The ones who did." She shuddered. "They weren't the same men who went down." I thought about the impossible hallways I'd walked through, the rooms that shouldn't exist, the patients who weren't in any computer system. What happened to the cave system? They built the hospital right on top of it, sealed most of the entrances, but not all of them. They couldn't seal all of them. She leaned closer, her breath smelling of fear and medication. "The things that live down there, they're still here. They've always been here, and they're getting stronger." A chill ran down my spine as pieces of a horrible puzzle began to fall into place. "The rules," I said. "The notebook full of rules. They're not just for safety, are they?" Mrs. Henderson smiled grimly. "The rules are a treaty, dear. An agreement worked out over decades between the hospital administration and the things that live in the spaces between our world and theirs. Follow the rules, and most of the time, they leave the staff alone. Most of the time, there have been accidents over the years. Nurses and doctors who didn't follow the rules, or who asked too many questions. They disappear, usually during the night shift. Officially, they quit without notice or transferred to other facilities. But the old-timers know better." I thought about Janet's earlier comment about time moving differently at night, about David's pale complexion and nervous demeanor, about Patricia's constant whispering and furtive glances. How long have they known about this? Anyone who works here longer than a few months figures it out eventually. Most quit. Some stay because the pay is good and the rules usually keep you safe. A few. She trailed off, staring at the wall again. A few started to change, started to become something else. The photograph in my hands was growing warmer now, and when I looked at it again, I could see movement in the image. Shadows shifting in windows that had been empty moments before, figures walking through corridors that seemed to extend infinitely deeper into the building than should have been possible. "I have to get out of here," I said, more to myself than to Mrs. Henderson. "Yes," she agreed, "but be careful. They know you're thinking about leaving. They can sense when someone is about to break the treaty." As if summoned by her words, the lights in room 224 flickered 3 times in quick succession. the same signal I'd seen earlier in the nurse's station. Mrs. Henderson pulled her blankets up to her chin and closed her eyes tightly. "Don't look at them directly," she whispered. "And whatever you do, don't let them know you can see them." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I became aware of a presence behind me. Not human. The feeling was too alien, too wrong for anything that had ever been human. I could hear breathing, but it was the wet, labored sound I'd heard from room 101, as if lungs filled with fluid were struggling to process air. In the reflection on the dark window, I could see a shape standing directly behind me. It was tall, taller than any person should be, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. Its face was a blur of shifting features, as if it couldn't decide what form to take. The thing leaned closer, and I felt its breath on the back of my neck, cold and smelling of earth and decay. When it spoke, its voice was a perfect imitation of my own. "You're learning so much on your first night, Rebecca," it said with my voice. "But some knowledge comes with a price." I forced myself to remain perfectly still, remembering Mrs. Henderson's warning about not letting them know I could see them. In the window's reflection, the creature's face was cycling through different appearances, sometimes human, sometimes not, sometimes a horrible mixture of both. "The treaty is very clear," it continued, still using my voice. "Those who learn too much must choose. Become part of the hospital, or become part of the caves beneath it." The presence behind me grew stronger, more oppressive. I could feel the creature's attention, like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. In the reflection, I saw it reach out with fingers that were far too long, stretching toward the back of my head. That's when I ran. I burst out of room 224 and sprinted down the hallway toward the nurse's station, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum with each step. Behind me, I could hear laughter, not just from one voice, but from dozens, echoing from every room I passed. The nurse's station was empty when I reached it, all three of my colleagues nowhere to be seen. The notebook lay open on my desk, but the pages were blank now, as if the rules had never existed at all. Only one sentence remained, written in fresh red ink that looked disturbingly like blood. "The night shift never ends for those who break the treaty." I grabbed my purse and car keys, not bothering with the elevator, but heading straight for the stairwell. As I ran down the stairs, I could hear sound from behind the walls, scratching, breathing, and what might have been voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The automatic doors in the lobby were locked, their sensors dark and unresponsive. I could see my car in the parking lot beyond the glass, so close, but impossibly far away. The security guard was still at his desk, but when I approached him for help, I realized he wasn't sleeping. He was dead, had probably been dead for hours, his eyes cloudy and staring. That's when I noticed the small door marked "Maintenance" beside the information desk. It was propped slightly open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. From somewhere far below came the sound of wind moving through vast spaces, and I realized I was looking at one of the unsealed entrances to the cave system Mrs. Henderson had described. The scratching sounds in the walls grew louder, more insistent. Whatever lived in the spaces between worlds was getting impatient with my presence. I had to find another way out. I remembered seeing a fire exit during my earlier rounds, somewhere near the east wing. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way back through the corridors that had seemed so normal just hours ago. Now, every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made me jump and look over my shoulder. The fire exit was exactly where I remembered it, but the crash bar was chained shut with a padlock that looked decades old. A sign beside it read, "Emergency use only. Alarm will sound." At this point, I didn't care about alarms. I just needed to get out. I picked up a fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed it against the chain. The metal gave way after 3 strikes, the crash bar suddenly free. I pushed against it with all my strength, and the door swung open into the humid Texas night. No alarm sounded. The building remained eerily quiet behind me. I ran across the parking lot to my car, fumbling with the keys as something howled from inside the hospital, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but somehow worse than either. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, but finally the engine turned over. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I looked back at Mercy General Hospital one last time. Every window was now blazing with light, and I could see figures moving through the corridors. Too many figures, moving in ways that defied human anatomy. In my rearview mirror, I watched the building grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something from inside was following me, keeping pace with my car through the darkness. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the outskirts of Dallas as the sun was rising. Only then did I allow myself to believe I had actually escaped. But escape, I would soon learn, was a relative term when dealing with the things that live beneath Mercy General Hospital. 3 months have passed since that horrific night at Mercy General Hospital, but I still wake up in cold sweats, my sheets soaked with perspiration, and my heart racing from dreams I can't quite remember. The official story is that I quit my position due to personal reasons. At least, that's what my employment records show. I never filed a formal resignation, never spoke to anyone in administration, but somehow the paperwork exists, complete with my forged signature. The paycheck for that single night shift appeared in my bank account exactly 2 weeks later, along with a substantial bonus that I never requested. When I tried to return the money, I discovered that Mercy General Hospital had no record of employing me. According to their Human Resources Department, no one named Rebecca had ever worked there, and they had no openings for night shift nurses. It's as if that night never happened, at least not in any way that the outside world would recognize. I've tried to research the hospital to find some documentation of the things I experienced, but information about Mercy General is surprisingly scarce. The official records show it was built in 1962 on the site of an old cotton field, with no mention of caves or unusual geological features. The construction workers who built it have long since died or moved away, taking their secrets with them. But I did find one disturbing piece of information in the archives of the local newspaper. Over the past 60 years, there have been dozens of reports of nurses and doctors who simply vanished from the area. They quit their jobs without notice, leaving behind apartments full of belongings and lives that seemed to be going well. In every case, their former colleagues described them as dedicated healthcare workers who loved their profession. The disappearances always happened after they'd worked at Mercy General, usually following a night shift rotation. I tried to contact Janet, Patricia, and David, the nurses who trained me that night, but it's impossible to find any trace of them outside the hospital. They don't appear in any professional nursing directories, have no social media presence, no addresses or phone numbers I can locate. It's as if they exist only within the walls of Mercy General, trapped in their eternal night shift. The notebook haunts my dreams. Even though I left it behind when I fled, I can still recite many of the rules from memory. Sometimes I wake up with new rules written on scraps of paper beside my bed, in handwriting that looks disturbingly like my own. Rules for places I've never been, situations I've never encountered. Rule number 73. If you hear your name being called from inside a mirror, do not answer. Rule number 84. The elevator in Building C should never be used alone after sunset. Rule number 91. If a patient offers to show you something interesting in the basement, decline politely and leave immediately. I don't know where these rules come from or why I keep writing them down, but each morning when I find them, I feel compelled to read them carefully, to memorize them, as if my life might someday depend on following their bizarre instructions. The worst part is the growing suspicion that my escape wasn't as complete as I initially believed. Small things have changed in my daily life, subtle alterations that make me question my own sanity. My reflection sometimes appears slightly off in mirrors, as if it's looking at something just over my shoulder. Food tastes different, especially at night, carrying flavors of earth and decay that remind me of the smell that permeated Mercy General's impossible hallways. And then there are the dreams. Every night, I find myself walking through corridors that shift and change around me, following rules that exist only in the spaces between sleeping and waking. In these dreams, I'm still working at the hospital, still making my rounds, still trying to help patients who may not be entirely human. Janet, Patricia, and David are always there, offering advice and warnings that make perfect sense until I wake up and try to remember them clearly. "You can't really leave," Dream Janet told me last night. "Once you've seen behind the walls, once you know what exists in the spaces between floors, you're part of it forever. The treaty extends beyond the building now." I've considered seeing a therapist, but how do you explain to a mental health professional that you worked one night at a hospital that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously? How do you describe patients who call from rooms that shouldn't exist, or rules that seem to rewrite themselves based on whatever supernatural forces happen to be active on any given night? Instead, I've taken a position at a modern hospital in downtown Dallas, working day shifts exclusively. The work is routine, predictable, grounded in evidence-based medicine and rational thinking. My colleagues are normal people with normal problems, and the patients are suffering from conditions that can be diagnosed and treated through conventional means. But sometimes, usually late in the afternoon when my shift is ending and the day staff is preparing to hand over responsibilities to the night crew, I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. A shadow moving against the flow of traffic in a hallway. A room number that changes when I'm not looking directly at it. The faint sound of children laughing from a floor that houses only adult patients. And I know, with the certainty that comes from experience with the impossible, that the influence of Mercy General Hospital is spreading. Whatever exists beneath that building, whatever made the treaty with the hospital administration decades ago, it's not content to remain confined to a single location in rural Texas. The rules are propagating, infecting other medical facilities like a virus that targets the places where life and death intersect most frequently. Other hospitals are developing their own impossible spaces, their own patients who exist outside official records, their own night shifts that operate according to protocols that have nothing to do with healing and everything to do with survival. Last week, I found a handwritten note in my locker at work. It wasn't in my handwriting, and I have no idea how it got there. The message was simple but chilling. The night shift position at Mercy General remains open. Your experience makes you an ideal candidate. Starting salary has been increased to reflect your qualifications. Please report for duty at 11 p.m. any evening you choose. The rules are waiting for you. The note was signed with an illegible scrawl, but at the bottom was a small symbol that made my vision blur when I looked at it directly. The same symbol I'd seen carved into the walls of that impossible third floor. I threw the note away, but the next morning it was back in my locker, as if it had never been discarded. I burned it, but within days a new copy appeared. No matter what I do to get rid of it, the invitation always returns, patient and persistent as the things that extended it. I know that eventually, I'll run out of strength to resist. The dreams are getting stronger, more vivid, and I'm starting to remember entire conversations with patients whose names don't appear in any hospital records. Part of me, a part that grows larger each night, wants to go back, wants to walk those impossible hallways again, to follow rules that make sense only in the context of a reality that exists parallel to our own. The worst part is that I'm beginning to understand that my experience at Mercy General wasn't an anomaly or a mistake. It was a recruitment. The things that live beneath the hospital are always looking for new staff members, people with the skills and temperament necessary to serve as intermediaries between the human patients and the entities that feed on fear, confusion, and the thin places where our world brushes against others. They let me escape because they knew I'd come back eventually. They knew that once someone has seen behind the walls of reality, once they've glimpsed the true nature of the spaces where healing and horror intersect, they can never truly return to a normal life. So I write this as a warning, though I suspect it's already too late. If you're in a medical field and you see job postings for rural hospitals offering unusually high pay for night shift work, be very careful. Read the reviews from former employees if you can find them. Ask detailed questions about the facility's history and the nature of their patient population. And if you do take such a position, if you find yourself walking through corridors that seem to extend farther than the building's blueprint would allow, if you're given a notebook full of rules that contradict everything you learned in nursing school, if patients call your name from rooms that shouldn't exist, follow the rules exactly. Don't ask questions. Don't investigate sounds that have no rational source. And whatever you do, don't try to help the patient in room 101, no matter how desperately they plead for your assistance. But most importantly, trust your instincts. If every fiber of your being is telling you to leave, if you feel like you're being watched by things that have never been human, if the hospital feels more like a trap than a place of healing, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back. Because once you've been marked by the things that live in the spaces between floors, once you become part of their extended network of influence, the only choice left is whether you'll serve them willingly or spend the rest of your life fighting a battle you cannot win. The night shift at Mercy General Hospital is still open. The pay is excellent, the benefits are comprehensive, and the work offers opportunities for professional growth that you'll find nowhere else in the medical field. But remember, some jobs change you in ways you can never undo, and some places never truly let you leave. I should know. Tomorrow night, I start my second shift.